Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. The Mediterranean and Eastern Europe, June 1940 through June 1941. The collapse of France had a shattering effect along the Soviet-German borderlands, from the Baltic to the Aegean Sea. In the week following June 15, 1940, the Soviet Union sent peremptory notes to Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, demanding that their governments be reorganized to include persons more acceptable to the Kremlin. Since Soviet armed forces were already within these states, and no hand of assistance was raised anywhere, least of all in Berlin, the Baltic countries yielded to the Soviet demands. In the first week of August, the three new governments held elections, in typical Soviet fashion, with only a single list of candidates. The newly elected parliaments at once sought and obtained union with Soviet Russia as socialist Soviet republics. Farther south, Romania's hopes that the Anglo-French guarantee of April 1939 might bring support from Weygand's forces in Syria were dashed by Weygand's defeat in France. On May 29, 1940, at a Romanian Crown Council, King Carroll insisted that protection must be sought elsewhere and that only an alignment with Germany would permit Romania to resist any possible Soviet pressure. It was felt that Germany's need for Romanian oil would make it very unwilling to allow the war to spread to that area. Accordingly, Romania abandoned its policy of neutrality and aligned itself with Germany. The foreign minister, Grigor Gafencu, resigning in protest at the new policy. Romania did not obtain the benefits it had hoped from its change in policy. On June 29, 1940, having previously notified Germany, the Soviet Union demanded Bessarabia and northern Bukovina from Romania within 24 hours. Germany protested against the demand for Bukovina, since this had not been granted to Russia in the Nazi-Soviet agreement of August 1939. Otherwise, Germany made no objection, although Hitler was personally disturbed and had to be reassured by Ribbentrop that he had actually agreed to give Bessarabia to the Soviet Union. The loss of Bessarabia was a severe blow to the more moderate leaders in Romania. But worse was yet to come. On August 26th, Hitler summoned Romanian leaders to Vienna, and, in the presence of Count Chiano and representatives of Hungary, forced Romania to give 2/3 of Transylvania to Hungary. In return, Germany gave Romania a guarantee of its new, reduced frontiers. The Vienna Award destroyed the forces of moderation within Romania. Riots and assassinations became the regular method of domestic political activity. These were instigated very largely by the Iron Guard, a reactionary anti-Semitic political group which had been in quasi-civil war with the Romanian government since 1933, but had been suppressed by the strong-arm tactics of King Carroll. On September 5, 1940, an Iron Guard government under Ion Antonescu took office in Bucharest. Its first act was to depose the king and chase him into exile, replacing him on the throne by his son Mikhail. 2 days later, under indirect German pressure, southern Dobruja was yielded to Bulgaria. Thus, in the space of a week, the territorial gains Romania had made at the expense of 3 of her neighbors in 1919 were largely cancelled. Moscow protested against the Vienna Award on the grounds that it had not been consulted, and that no guarantee of Romania by Germany was necessary. These protests were rejected on the basis that Berlin had been informed of various Soviet activities with equally small notice, and that the guarantee was necessary to forestall any possible British attack on the Romanian oil fields. Shortly thereafter, German military units began to move into Romania, while Soviet units began to seize the uninhabited islands in the mouths of the Danube. At the same time, a German military occupation of Finland began under the pretext that the forces in question were en route to Norway, September 19th. The confusion following the defeat of France spread quickly to the Mediterranean area. This was dominated by two factors. One, Mussolini's jealous determination to obtain some glorious conquest in the Mediterranean to match Hitler's impressive victories in the north. And two, the complete inadequacy, from Germany's point of view, of the terms of the French armistice. By these terms, neither Germany nor Italy obtained any units of the French fleet, any naval bases in the Mediterranean, or any parts of the French overseas territories. On June 24th, when the armistice was made, Hitler had been so convinced that Britain would make peace that he had neglected these items and had rebuffed Mussolini's efforts to include them. Within a month, Hitler recognized his error and demanded from France extensive military and naval bases and transport facilities in North Africa. July 15th through 1940. These demands were rejected by Pétain at once. Hitler had little real interest in the Mediterranean area at any time, and simply hoped that it would remain quiet. His personal belief, as soon as the invasion of Britain became remote, was that Britain wished to hold out until the Soviet Union became strong enough to attack Germany from the east. There is no evidence that the Soviet Union had any plans to do so, or that it was in communication with Britain in any such project, however remote, or that Hitler was afraid of Russia. On the contrary, the Soviet Union became, if anything, increasingly cooperative toward Germany, especially in the economic sphere, and by May 1941 was almost obsequious. All efforts for improved Anglo-Soviet understanding were rejected until after June 22, 1941. And Hitler, far from being fearful of the Soviet Union, despised it completely and was convinced that he could conquer it in a few weeks. His decision to attack Russia, first stated on July 29, 1940, and issued as a formal directive, Operation Barbarossa, on December 18th, was based on two considerations. 1. Only by destroying Russia and all Britain's hopes based on Russia could Britain be forced to ask for peace. And 2. Soviet cooperation with Germany was Stalin's personal policy and depended on his life, a factor regarded as too undependable to allow Germany to place any long-range expectations on it. In spite of Hitler's desires, the Mediterranean area could not be kept quiet. The inadequacy of the French armistice, Mussolini's demands for a more active Mediterranean policy, British naval successes against the Italian Navy, Admiral Raeder's warning that some defensive measures must be taken to avert any American intervention in French Africa. All these kept calling the Mediterranean to Hitler's attention at a time when he wanted to concentrate on the problem of how to attack the Soviet Union. In order to deter the United States from any intervention in West Africa, and in the belief that it would aid the anti-Roosevelt isolationists in the presidential election of 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed a military alliance on September 27, 1940. This tripartite pact, announced with great propagandist fanfare, provided that the signers would aid one another in every way if one of them was attacked by a power not already involved in the European War or in the Sino-Japanese conflict. To aim this agreement more specifically at the United States, and to allay the natural anxieties of the Soviet Union, one clause provided that the new pact would not change the existing relationships of the signers with Russia. As we shall see in a moment, Ribbentrop's efforts in November 1940 to obtain Soviet adherence to the Tripartite Pact led to a turning point in the Nazi-Soviet collaboration. As France was falling in June 1940, Spain assured Hitler that it would enter the war on Germany's side as soon as it had accumulated sufficient supplies, especially grain, to be able to resist the British blockade. This assurance was repeated by Ramón Serrano Suñer, the Spanish foreign minister, brother-in-law of Señora Franco, in Berlin on September 17th. About the same time, Admiral Raeder spoke to Hitler about the need to exclude Britain from the Mediterranean by capturing Gibraltar and Suez. To these possible objectives, Hitler added the idea of seizing some of the Canary or Cape Verde Islands, or even one of the Azores, to be used as defensive points against any American attempt to land in French West Africa. About the same time, in September 1940, under pressure from pro-German collaborators led by Laval, Marshal Pétain removed Weygand from his post as Minister of National Defense and sent him to Africa as coordinator and commander-in-chief of the French colonial possessions there. Fearful that Weygand might cooperate with an American landing, Hitler, at the middle of October, began serious efforts to settle the Western Mediterranean situation once and for all, in cooperation with Vichy France and Franco Spain. In anticipation of such an attempt, Britain in July 1940 had attacked and largely destroyed the major vessels of the French fleet at anchor at Mers el Khyber, near Oran, Algeria, and at Dakar, West Africa. With somewhat greater skill, the French units at Alexandria, Egypt, were demobilized by agreement. These British attacks on French vessels and subsequent de Gaullist attacks with British support on Dakar, September 23rd, and elsewhere, were probably unnecessary and served to drive the Vichy regime into the arms of the Germans. On June 24, 1940, the French Navy had been ordered to scuttle its vessels if there was any chance of their falling into control of foreigners, be they German, Italian, or British. The fact that Britain killed 1,400 French seamen by bombardment of anchored vessels greatly increased the normally anti-British bias of the Vichy regime, and made it possible for the most anti-British members, such as Laval or Admiral Darlan, to eliminate the more moderate ones, like General Weygand. Hitler's efforts to coordinate Fascist Italy, Franco Spain, and Vichy France in a single policy in the Western Mediterranean was not an easy one, as Italy and Spain expected to satisfy their shameless ambitions at French expense, while Hitler trusted neither France nor Spain. On October 22, 1940, Hitler traveled by train to the Spanish frontier to confer with Franco and obtain a commitment to attack Gibraltar. Franco's demands were not modest. He wanted French Morocco, parts of Algeria, and French West Africa, about 500,000 tons of grain, and the motor fuel and armaments necessary for the capture of Gibraltar. For this, as Hitler bitterly told Mussolini, Franco offered Germany his friendship. Hitler also obtained Franco's promise to enter the war on Germany's side at some indefinite date in the future and to join the Tripartite Pact at once, if this could be kept secret. Disappointed in the south, Hitler's train returned northward across France. The following day, October 24, 1940, Hitler and Ribbentrop met Pétain and Laval at Montois-sur-le-Loire and drew up a rather ambiguous agreement. This document proclaimed the signers joint interest in the speedy defeat of Britain and promised that France, in return for a favorable attitude toward the territorial ambitions of Italy and Spain, would be allowed to share in the booty of the disrupted British Empire at the end of the war, so that the total overseas possessions of France would not be reduced in that area. 4 days later, Laval was made foreign minister of the Vichy regime. At this point, Hitler's disappointments began to flow over. Having just concluded unsatisfactory agreements with Spain and France, he received at Montois a delayed message from Mussolini, forwarded from Berlin, announcing that Italy was about to attack Greece. Since Hitler and Ribbentrop had vetoed any attack on either Greece or Yugoslavia as early as July 7th, and had repeated this warning several times since, Hitler at once ordered his train from France to Florence to dissuade Mussolini from his projected attack on Greece. When the two leaders met in Florence, October 28, 1940, the Italian attack on Greece had already begun. So they restricted their discussion to other topics, such as the ingratitude of General Franco. During the summer of 1940, Mussolini's irascible disposition had not been improved by the failure of Italian ground forces against France, the meager results of the French-Italian armistice, the failure of the Italian navy to disrupt British convoys to Malta and Alexandria, the complete collapse of the Italian Air Force, and a series of German vetoes against any Italian movement against Yugoslavia or Greece. The Duce's efforts to attack Egypt over land from Libya were resisted by his generals for months. When Rodolfo Graziani finally attacked on September 13th, he advanced without difficulty a distance of 70 miles in 5 days, to Sidi Barani in Egypt. There he stopped and refused to go on. Thirsty for some success to console his wounded ego, the Duce of Fascism decided to attack Greece. The German military occupation of Romania was the final straw which broke his imperious patience. "Hitler always faces me with a fait accompli," he told Count Chiano. "This time I'm going to pay him back in his own coin. He will find out from the newspapers that I have occupied Greece. In this way the equilibrium will be re-established." The Italian generals were unanimously against the project and had to be driven to it. In an outburst to Chiano, Mussolini threatened to go personally to Greece, to see the incredible shame of Italians who are afraid of Greeks. Unfortunately for Mussolini, his generals had better judgment than he had. The attack, which began from Albania on October 28th, was stopped completely within 3 weeks. The subsequent Greek counterattack carried deep into Albania, and Greek pressure continued throughout the winter. As promised in the guarantee of April 1939, Britain joined Greece against Italy at once, but its own weakness did not allow any substantial increase in its forces in the area. On November 11, 1940, 21 British planes made a torpedo attack on the chief units of the Italian fleet in Taranto harbor and sank 3 out of 6 battleships at a cost of 2 planes and 1 pilot killed. A month later, on December 7, 1940, Graziani's forces of 80,000 men in Egypt were suddenly attacked by General Archibald Wavell, with 31,000 men and 225 tanks. In 2 months, at a cost of only 500 killed, Wavell captured 130,000 Italians with 400 tanks and 1,300 cannon and advanced westward 600 miles to El Agheila. Shortly thereafter, in an equally brief period, February 11th through April 6, 1941, Italian East Africa and Ethiopia were conquered and 100,000 Italian troops destroyed by a British imperial force which suffered only 135 killed. The Italian failures in Greece and Africa along with Franco's refusal to attack Gibraltar, forced a considerable rearrangement of Hitler's plans. In the space of 2 weeks, December 7th through the 21st, 1940, Franco flatly refused to execute Operation Felix, December 7th, and accordingly, this project was cancelled, December 11th. Italy decided to ask for German and Bulgarian aid against Greece. The Nazi-Soviet rivalry in Bulgaria and Finland came to a head, and 3 new war directives were ordered by Hitler: Operations Attila, Marita, and Barbarossa. Operation Attila, December 10th, sought partial compensation for the abandonment of Operation Felix by ordering an immediate occupation of all Vichy France, with a special effort to capture elements of the French fleet in Toulon, if French North Africa rebelled against the Vichy government. This plan was carried out when the Western powers invaded North Africa in November 1942. The Italian appeal to Germany for aid against Greece, December 7th, led to a transformation of the relationship between the two powers. Italy's status changed from that of an ally to that of a satellite. On December 19th, Hitler promised to attack Greece from Bulgaria, but not before March 1941, at the earliest. He rejected a detailed Italian request for raw materials on the ground that he had no way of knowing how these would be used. Instead, he suggested that large numbers of Italian laborers should be sent to Germany and there work up the raw materials into finished products which could then be sent to Italy to be used according to the advice of German experts stationed in Italy. For the immediate relief of Italy's military problems, Hitler refused to send any forces to Albania to fight Greece, but instead offered an armored force under General Rommel to fight in Libya, and a German air fleet of about 500 planes to be stationed in Sicily to protect fascist convoys to Libya and to disrupt British convoys through the Mediterranean. The German intervention in the central Mediterranean in the early months of 1941 was a great success on the ground and in the air, but was not able to prevent the British from strengthening their position on the water. The first Malta convoy of 1941 was badly battered by the first intervention of the Luftwaffe. Britain's sole aircraft carrier in the eastern Mediterranean, Illustrious, was damaged so badly that it had to limp to the United States, by way of Suez and around Africa, for repairs. No other British convoy got through the Mediterranean for 4 months. On the other hand, Rommel's force was transported to Libya without loss. These 2 blows to Britain were somewhat balanced by a British naval victory over the Italians off Cape Matapan on March 28th through 29th, 1941. With the loss of 1 man in 1 plane, Britain sank 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers and damaged a battleship. This battle is notable for the first use of radar-controlled gunnery at sea. With this innovation, at night, the opening salvo of 6 15-inch guns by Warspite scored 5 hits. Earlier in the engagement, in the daylight, the Italian battleship Vittorio Veneto fired more than 90 15-inch shells without a hit. As a consequence of this battle, Mussolini ordered the Italian fleet not to operate beyond the range of Italian land-based fighter planes until an aircraft carrier could be built. Accordingly, the Italian Navy played no role in the subsequent struggle for Libya, Greece, and Crete. Rommel's arrival in Libya reversed the situation in North Africa. He had tanks and good air support against British forces, which had been largely depleted by sending an armored division to Greece. Landed at Piraeus on March 7th. This division and 3 infantry divisions were sent to Greece over the objections of the very able Greek commander-in-chief, General Alexander Papagos, who thought that withdrawal of troops from success in Africa to certain failure in Europe was a strategic error. Striking at El Agheila, with a German armored division supported by 2 Italian divisions on March 31, 1941, Rommel reached the Egyptian frontier on April 11th. In the meantime, Ribbentrop was engaged in involved diplomatic maneuvers. The Tripartite Pact of September 1940, in spite of Russia's suspicions, was really intended to frighten the United States to abstain from interference in the tumults of Eurasia. To strengthen this threat, Ribbentrop sought to obtain Russia's adherence to the Tripartite Pact and a Soviet-Japanese non-aggression pact which would free Japan in Asia to allow it to strike southward against Singapore. These maneuvers were a disaster for Germany. Futile efforts to obtain Soviet adherence to the Tripartite Pact merely succeeded in revealing the bitter German-Soviet rivalry in Bulgaria and Finland. While the successful Soviet-Japanese non-aggression pact of April 13, 1941 made it possible to withdraw Soviet troops from the Far East in sufficient numbers to save Moscow from Hitler's attack on that city in November. During Molotov's visit to Berlin on November 12th through the 15th, 1940, Germany offered the Soviet Union a worldwide division of spheres of influence among the aggressor states. Italy would take North and East Africa. Germany would take Western Europe, Western and Central Africa. Japan could have Malay and Indonesia, while the Soviet Union could have Iran and India. Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union would pursue a cooperative policy in the Near East to free Turkey from its British connections and obtain for Russia freer access to the Mediterranean through the Dardanelles. Hitler offered Molotov a picture of a brilliant, if remote, future. After the conquest of England, the British Empire would be apportioned as a gigantic worldwide estate in bankruptcy of 40 million square kilometers. In this bankrupt estate, there would be for Russia access to the ice-free and really open ocean. Thus far, a minority of 45 million Englishmen had ruled 600 million inhabitants of the British Empire. He, Hitler, was about to crush this minority. Even the United States was actually doing nothing but picking out of this bankrupt estate a few items particularly suitable to the United States. He wanted to create a world coalition of interested powers, which would consist of Spain, France, Italy, Germany, Soviet Russia, and Japan, and would to a certain degree represent a coalition extending from North Africa to Eastern Asia, of all those who wanted to be satisfied out of the British bankrupt estate. Molotov was only mildly interested in these grandiose schemes about spheres of interest, and seemed to have no ambitions in respect to the British Empire. Instead, he wanted detailed answers to specific questions. Why were German troops stationed in Finland? Could not an accurate demarcation between Soviet and Nazi interests be drawn in Finland? Why could not the Nazi guarantee of Romania be balanced by a Soviet guarantee of Bulgaria? Or, failing in this, the Romanian guarantee be cancelled? What were the exact limits of Germany's new order in Europe and of Japan's East Asian sphere? After hours of discussion, during which the Germans evaded Molotov's questions about Finland and Bulgaria, Ribbentrop offered Russia a protocol covering 5 points. 1. The Soviet Union would join the Tripartite Pact. 2. The four powers would respect each other's natural spheres of influence. 3. They would undertake to join no combination of powers and to support no combination of powers which is directed against one of the four powers. 4. The four respective spheres of influence would follow the vague German suggestions And 5. The three European powers would seek to detach Turkey from British influence and to open the Dardanelles to the free passage of Soviet warships. Molotov immediately presented Germany with additional proposals, drawn up in a formal draft protocol. These added to the German suggestions 5 other points. 1. That German troops be withdrawn from Finland immediately. 2. That Bulgaria sign a mutual assistance pact with the Soviet Union and hand over to it a base from which Russian naval and air forces could defend the Dardanelles. 3. That the area from Batum and Baku to the Persian Gulf be recognized as a center of Soviet aspirations. 4. That Japan yield to the Soviet Union its oil and coal concessions in northern Sakhalin. And 5. That the prospective agreement with Turkey be expanded to include a Soviet military and naval base on the Bosporus and Dardanelles, and a guarantee of Turkish independence and territorial integrity by all 3 powers. Molotov's conditions for joining the Tripartite Pact enraged Hitler. 4 weeks later, he issued orders for Operation Barbarossa, a joint Finnish-German-Romanian attack on the Soviet Union. Before this could be carried out, however, the ambiguous situation on the German right flank in the Balkans had to be cleared up by Operation Marita. The chief aims of this operation were to drive from the area British forces which had entered Greece in consequence of the Italian attack, and to prevent them from bombing the Romanian oil fields while Germany was occupied with Russia. The original plan called for a pincers movement into Greece from Bulgaria and Yugoslavia after these 2 countries had been brought into the Axis system by diplomatic activity. German forces moved steadily into Romania, beginning in October 1940. 4 months later, Moscow was informed by Hitler that these occupying forces had reached almost 700,000 men. On March 1st, Bulgaria joined the Tripartite Pact, and these German forces began to occupy that country the same day. Yugoslavia did not succumb so easily. For almost 6 weeks, because of strong opposition in the country and in the cabinet, Regent Prince Paul resisted the German demands. When Yugoslavia accepted and signed the Tripartite Pact at Vienna on March 25th, it was able to obtain promises of substantial concessions in return: freedom from any German military occupation, release from any promise of military support to Germany under the pact, and a promise of German support for Yugoslavia's desire for an outlet on the Aegean at Salonika. Soviet opposition to these German advances was somewhat indirect. There were vigorous protests against the movement of German troops into Romania and Bulgaria. Turkey was informed that Russia would abide fully by the Soviet-Turkish Non-Aggression Pact of 1925 if Turkey became involved in hostilities with a third power, meaning Germany. Most significant of all, a military coup d'etat in Yugoslavia overthrew the Yugoslav Regency and government on the night of March 26th to the 27th, replacing the regent, Prince Paul, as head of the state by the young King Peter, and installing a less pliant cabinet under General Dusan Simovic. This new government signed a treaty of friendship and non-aggression with the Soviet Union on the night of April 5th through the 6th. Less than 6 hours later, Belgrade was subjected to a violent bombardment from the Luftwaffe, and 33 German divisions began to invade Yugoslavia and Greece. Both countries were overrun within 3 weeks and were divided up among the jackal collaborators of Nazi Germany. From Bulgaria and Hungary, Yugoslavia was invaded by 3 German columns. The 2 satellite states followed along behind to occupy the areas allotted to them. Greek forces, overextended into Albania in the west and outflanked by the German capture of Salonika in the east, fell back southward, but were soon cut off from 68,000 British troops in Thessaly. On April 20th, the Greek government advised the British to evacuate because the situation was hopeless, but the almost total destruction of Piraeus from the air and the sudden capture of the Corinth Canal by German paratroopers made this operation very difficult. Without air protection, the British Navy evacuated 44,000 British troops from various beaches, landing 27,000 of them on the island of Crete. After a week of bitter mountain fighting, much of it hand-to-hand with the German Air Force supreme in the sky, the British began to evacuate Crete. When the operation was over on May 1st, Britain had lost 55,000 men in Greece and Crete, and had 1 battleship, 7 cruisers, and 13 destroyers sunk or damaged. It had lost all North Africa except Egypt itself, and had seen 2 more countries overrun by Germany. The only possible consolation was to be found in the fact that Yugoslav and Greek resistance had delayed Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union by 3 weeks, and the heavy German losses in Crete, over 30% casualties, persuaded Hitler to renounce all airborne operations in the future. A somewhat more remote benefit rested in the fact that German brutality and Balkan stubbornness gave rise to extensive guerrilla operations, which drained Axis strength in the mountains of Yugoslavia, Crete, and Greece. The loss of Crete gravely threatened the British position in the Near East. In Iraq, on April 3rd, a group of army officers led by Rashid Ali el-Gailani overthrew the government and seized power. A month later, this new regime made an attack on British treaty installations in Mesopotamia. Admiral Darlan provided bases in Syria for German and Italian planes going to aid the rebels, and on May 28th signed Paris Protocols, which almost took France into the war on the side of Germany. These agreements promised to the Iraqi rebels most French military supplies in Syria, and to provide Germany with air bases in Syria and at Dakar, to hand over transport facilities, including ports and railroads in Syria, the port of Bizerte in Tunisia, the railroad from Bizerte to Gabes, French munitions for Germany, French ships for transporting supplies across the Mediterranean, French naval vessels for protecting such shipments, and a submarine base at Dakar. The violent objections of Weygand and other officers against these agreements and the vigorous protests of the United States persuaded Marshal Pétain to overrule Darlan and to cancel the agreements. June 6th. The rebellion in Iraq was overthrown in May, and a joint force of British and Free French supporters of de Gaulle conquered Syria and Lebanon in June. About the same time, by a tenacious defense of Malta and relentless attacks on Axis convoys to Libya, the British Navy sought to restore its control of the surface of the Mediterranean Sea. This made it necessary for the Axis, in spite of the growing demands of the Battle of the Atlantic and the Battle of Russia, to increase its air and undersea forces in the Mediterranean. In November 1941, 70% of Axis supplies for Libya were sunk. In September, Hitler sent the first German submarines, only 6 of them, to the Mediterranean, and in December he sent the second air fleet of 500 planes under Marshal Albert Kesselring to Sicily. In November, the British lost an aircraft carrier and a battleship to U-boats. The following month, in a daring personal exploit, the Italians sent 3 two-man human torpedoes into Alexandria harbor and sank the 2 British battleships left in the eastern Mediterranean. By June 1941, the attrition of British sea power was becoming almost unbearable. With only a handful of operational U-boats, plus some support from surface raiders and land-based planes, the Axis sank, in the period from September 1939 to June 1941, a total of 1,738 merchant ships, of a total tonnage of 7,118,112. In addition, almost 3 million tons were left damaged in ports. In buying supplies, chiefly from the United States, Britain had used up, by June 1941, almost two-thirds of its dollar assets, gold stocks, and marketable United States securities.